Hello, everyone. I'm Carrie Vogelji-Sang, your host of the Educator Wellness Podcast, here to share and promote my life's work and passion, all things wellness. But not just any wellness, we're here to discuss wellness specifically as it pertains to educators. I am a former elementary school teacher, and I am passionate about helping educators see wellness in a very different way. This podcast is dedicated to educators across the globe, creating a space for us to come together in an authentic and therapeutic way, sharing our stories, our hopes, our joys, our fears, our sorrows, and hopefully creating some space to share some laughter with one another as well. In our journey to learn how to support one another to prioritize wellness and enhance our overall well-being. Please join me as we talk with nationally recognized experts to guide us on a transformative journey of self-discovery, helping us to embrace and weave all dimensions of wellness into the fabric of both our personal and professional lives. Also, please note that the opinions and perspectives that are shared on this podcast do not necessarily represent those of the Scanlon Center for School Mental Health or the University of Iowa. Welcome back to the Scanlon Center for School Mental Health Educator Wellness Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Carrie Vogelji-Sang, and you are in for a special treat today. We are covering a topic that has, I think, been our most requested topic to cover since we started this podcast. It is social media, the use of social media and how it impacts the development of our children and our adolescents, how it's impacting the way we educate our children and our adolescents, and even how we parent them. We are joined today by expert guest, Dr. Jackie Nisi. Dr. Nisi is a clinical psychologist and an assistant professor at Brown University and author of the popular weekly newsletter Techno Sapiens. If you aren't familiar with this newsletter, I highly encourage you to Google it and to join. She gives really amazing advice and guidance about technology and technology use with children and with adolescents. Her research focuses on the role of technology in kids' mental health, especially teens, and how parents can help. She is the co-founder of Tech Without Stress, which provides online resources and courses for parents raising kids in the digital age. Again, I highly suggest you Google Tech Without Stress. Great online resources for all of you. So please join me and our special guest, Dr. Nisi, as we talk all things social media. Welcome, Dr. Jackie Nisi. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I'm so excited for you to join us. This has been such a hot topic. It's been probably one of our most requested topics since we started the podcast, and not just for the podcast, but for our webinars and for professional development in general, talking about social media and the effects that it has on children and adolescents and what's going on with social media in our schools and our society, how it's impacting us as human beings. So I think we have a lot to unpack with you today.
Yeah, those are good questions.
Yeah, I'm really excited to get started, but maybe we should just start at the very beginning with you. When did you start to get interested yourself in studying and researching social media and the impacts that it has on children, particularly teenagers, and just kind of how they navigate their lives?
Yeah, so there was actually a pretty specific experience that I had that got me interested in this particular topic. I've always been interested in psychology and in adolescent development. But when I was in college, actually, I used to work for this company leading these outdoor adventure and service trips in the summers for high school students. And as part of that, we used to take away all of their devices at the beginning of these trips. And this was in, 2012 that I was doing this. And what we found is that when we did that, when we took away the devices, it really changed the whole dynamic of the trip. Students were a lot more engaged. A lot of students talked about feeling, less stress because they weren't having to deal with their devices. And through that experience, I think it just really sparked my interest in how are these technologies that we're using at this point all day, every day in many cases, influencing both adolescent development and, how we're developing into adults. And so that was kind of the topic that I decided to study going into becoming a clinical psychologist. I noticed there wasn't a lot of research on it, and I felt it was something that was really important for us to understand.
Yeah, well, we really appreciate you doing that because I think we're all still trying to figure this out, right? Like,
Yeah.
what are the benefits? What are the downfalls? Where do we set boundaries? And there's new technologies that are coming out constantly too. And so it's especially for somebody like me and my later 40s now, it's hard to keep tabs on or keep up with what are all the things that children and the adolescents are being exposed to and how are they interfacing with these things and how is it impacting they're not just like the way that they're socializing, but their brains, their growth.
Yeah.
So I guess that's maybe where we should start. Like, is it true that the amount of time that children and adolescents are spending with technology, whether it's watching television or videos or video games or social media, does that impact like their development, the function of their brain or their emotional development, social development? Is this true?
Yeah, I mean, this is a big question, and I think it's a tricky question. The first thing I'll say is that I think that anything that a young person is spending a lot of time doing, particularly during the teenage years, which we know are really formative for the brain, and more broadly for emotional and social development, we know that anything they spend a lot of time doing is going to impact that. So it's going to have an impact on how they see the world, how they see themselves, in most cases on their brain development. But what we don't necessarily know is exactly what that impact is. We don't know, I think it's hard to say whether that impact is positive, negative, likely some combination of the two. So it is true that it's having an impact on them. What kind of impact, I think, is a trickier thing to answer.
Okay, so let's rewind. So when we're talking about children being exposed to technology, is there like a typical type of technology that not adolescents but children, let's say maybe PK through grade 6 are typically engaging with? What would that be?
Yeah. So, in the younger age ranges, I think that we see a lot more TV watching. So teens watch TV too, but generally that tends to be the first kind of exposure that young kids have to technology is watching shows, like kids shows and that kind of thing, either on a TV or on an iPad. Or some kind of tablet. Eventually, we do see some apps and games as well that kids will be playing. But typically at that age, we're not seeing a lot of social media as we would maybe traditionally define it. But there's certainly, we know that even at that young age, that there's a lot of technology exposure that's already happening, even from the time that kids are toddlers, so really young.
Why do you think that is? Like, obviously you walk around in our world and you see technology, right? But when I think back to, obviously there's different technology that we have now. Although, I had a television when I was growing up. It wasn't, but do you think parents are misusing technology right now as like a babysitter, for example?
This is a good question. I think that, like you said, I think that some amount of media exposure, even from a very young age, is just an extremely natural byproduct of the world that we live in. I think that there are devices everywhere and we're using them a lot. And so kids are going to see that. I do think that there are times when maybe young people are watching too much or using too much media, where maybe it would be better for them to be having more kind of in-person interactions with a caregiver. But, I think in many cases, it's also out of necessity for some families where they sort of need that time for a child to be occupied doing something that's safe and, and free and available. But, it's one of those things where I think there are there are probably pros and cons where, some amount of it is certainly okay at that age, but at some point it can be too much. And depending on the type of content, I think it can become more problematic if the content, for example, is not appropriate or isn't
Sure.
right for that age. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so when I was prepping for this podcast, I was, going reading through articles and listening to other podcasts and such. And it's interesting, and I'm sure this is maybe even frustrating for you, because there's some literature out there that is like, do not let children,
Mm-hmm.
have any contact with technology. Like there's that extreme,
Yeah.
right? We both know, I have adult children now, but even when my adult children were children, even at that point in time, like that was just an impossibility, is too much technology that was, unless I had decided to sell my house in Iowa City, in the middle of Iowa City, and move off to off the grid somewhere. This was not going to happen. They were going to go to friends' homes, so on and so forth. So, and then of course there's like this other camp, that extreme camp that is like, it's really not that big of a deal. So like, I'm guessing you fall somewhere in the middle. Or maybe not.
Somewhere in the middle, yeah.
What is the amount of time? So is there like a magic number where you're like, no, ages 0 to 3, they shouldn't be exposed more than this many minutes, or and so forth?
Yeah. So the easy answer to that is no. There is not a specific number. But in more detail, the American Academy of Pediatrics does make recommendations around for younger age groups. So they would recommend no screens under the age of 1, apart from FaceTiming, with friends or family, along with the parent, of course. And then from there, they would recommend, I think it's an hour or less per day, and making sure that that content is high quality, and that as much as possible it's done with a parent. Once we get into the older ages, like beyond kind of, early childhood, the AAP no longer gives a specific time recommendation. They used to limit it to 2 hours a day, but it's become clear that that's just not feasible, and that's not realistic in the world that we live in. Particularly when devices are being used for so many things, both good and bad. So now it's more about what technology is taking the place of, and sort of how it fits within this larger, your larger day-to-day life. So if it's getting in the way of things like sleep, or in-person social interactions, or exercise, time outside, things that we know are important for healthy development, then it's likely too much. If all those needs are already being met, and then technology is on top of that, then chances are that it's okay, as long as the technology itself is sort of high quality interaction.
Okay, I love that response. And I think that parents and educators are really going to value what you just said. And so I really want to highlight it and reiterate what you said. I'm going to repeat it back to you. Okay. So I'm not like explaining you.
Please do.
I think it's really important to hear, like, if your child is getting plenty of exercise, if your child is on a healthy sleep routine, if your child is, interacting with peers in a healthy way on a regular basis, face to face, and online too. I know that's if your child it has all of these other things in place in their life, then including technology on top of that seems to be fine. Correct?
Yes. Okay. Yeah, exactly. And I think, this gets to also this larger question of once you know that like the amount of time is sort of working within a balanced lifestyle, then what's actually happening on the technology during that time that they're using it. And that's the next piece, I think, for parents and educators to think about is, is it, of course, this depends a lot on the age range, but, if they're using social media, what are they looking at? What are they being exposed to? Who are they talking to? Who are they friends with? And is that working for them or not? And similarly, for younger age ranges, there's a lot of emphasis on high quality content, which basically just means educational content that's age appropriate. So it depends. It depends, of course, what they're doing with the technology when they use it as well.
Yeah, and you have a couple different websites, correct?
I do.
Yeah, and we can share those in our notes with our audience, because I looked at them and they're really, really good. And you share some really great educational content that would be good to consider if you were an educator or a parent. So I just wanted to plug that in there and say,
Thank you.
listen, if you're listening to this right now, then make sure you come to our notes on our website. And I think we can post them somewhere on YouTube. But I don't know that for certain because I have a team of people that helps with this. So I'm looking into this for my use. But yeah, I really do want them to have a link to both of your websites, because I think that the stuff that I was finding on there was really, really useful.
Thank you.
Um, okay, so I wanted to also talk a little bit, and we started to talk about this, but it seems to me, again, when I was, scrolling through information, preparing for this chat with you, that one thing that people seem to all be on board with is no phones in the child or adolescent bedroom at night.
Mm.
No screens.
Yeah, I think that's generally, yeah, there's generally a good amount of consensus on that. I think, we know from the data and probably from common sense that when there are screens, particularly things like phones right next to the bed, that it can interfere with sleep if kids and teens are waking up to notifications in the middle of the night, checking messages, or even if they're on their screens leading up, sort of right until the moment when they do go to sleep, it can keep them up later. And then it can also interfere with the quality of their sleep. So, and we know that sleep, of course, is so important for mental and physical health. We're, I think, learning that more and more actually in recent years. And so I think that's sort of a straightforward guideline that works for a lot of families. I'm always hesitant to say that something has to happen a certain way, because of course there are situations where maybe a kid wants to use a device to play a meditation that they listen to before they go to sleep, and they don't have any issues with waking up in the middle of the night and checking it. Then of course that it wouldn't make sense to have that guideline. But for the most part, I think that can be a really helpful thing, both for kids and for parents, to try to keep the device out of the room at night.
Yeah. I know my boys are 22 and 18, and as you get to my age, and when your children are adults, and you start to think back on all of the terrible mistakes you made as a parent, and that is definitely one thing that has come to me as my children have gotten older, is like, that was a huge mistake that I made, and I would, if I could go back and change this, that, or the other, then that would be one thing that I would have changed too. I just think it just
it's a good reminder though that, like, different things work for different families, and I think very few of these decisions are, in some ways we're talking about very small impacts in some cases. So like very few of these decisions we're making about screens are really, life or death, where we can't, go back on them and change our minds or do something different in the future. I think that, we're all trying to do our best, and that's what matters. And that's certainly true when it comes to dealing with technology.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that. I feel like you just said that to make me feel better about my hair.
No, I really believe that. Or maybe I'm just saying it to make myself feel better.
No, I mean, I do agree with that though. I mean, just like what you're communicating right now, at least the way I'm hearing it and receiving it, is there is no one size fits all. And there's always going to be exceptions to the rule. And, I know that right now in particular with the mental health crisis that we're seeing particularly with adolescents, when we're going into schools to do PD, educators and parents, we're starting to work with more parents now, are really wanting like this like definitive, equation, or these are the things you have to do and it's going to all go away. And, some of the feedback we're getting is like, but you didn't give us a solution. Well, we can give you guidance and we can have conversations, but I agree with you. I do think that there are like some guidelines, and not just about social media, that you can give educators and parents, but there's always going to be exceptions. There's always going to be unique.
Yeah, I know. I empathize with that as, as a parent myself, just the, you do want, on most things, you want clear answers. You want, and I'm sure schools and educators feel the same, that they just want something straightforward and clear they can do. They want, everyone's concerned about the mental health crisis, of course. They're concerned about how we're all using these technologies. And so we want something that's like simple and an easy, or at least clear cut solution. But I think it's really challenging, especially when it comes to something as complex and multifaceted as mental health.
Mhm.
The answer isn't always so simple, unfortunately.
It isn't, especially as you know, when we're dealing with human beings. I mean, we're just complex
Yeah.
creatures.
Yeah.
So, and every family is unique and different. So it's just, yeah. Okay. What about social media? So this is the other thing. There's lots of different types of technologies, and we talked through like the different
Mhm.
ways of using technology, whether it's a program or YouTube or whatever. But we talk a lot about, and parents and teachers bring up a lot of concerns about social media,
Mhm.
Instagram, TikTok, Snapchat.
Mhm.
Um, is there like some more research or data around the use of social media, sorry, with adolescents,
Mhm.
um, and how it impacts our adolescents' way of participating in this world.
Mhm.
And that means like with friendships, with their families, if they're going to school or not, how they
Mhm.
engage in school. Is social media really that big of a deal with adolescents?
Mhm. This
I
is
mean,
this is the big question. And yeah, and there's a ton of research on this topic now. And what I'll say from the research so far at just a high level is that it depends, which is not the answer that we want to hear, because it's not an easy answer and it's not straightforward. But I think the impacts of social media really depend on how it's being used. And that depends a lot on who a kid is before they start using social media. So we know that the impacts really vary across different kids. Some kids will have the exact same experience on social media as another kid, and it'll have a really negative impact on them. And for another kid, it'll be totally fine and they'll brush it off and it's no big deal. Um,
Mhm.
so in terms of the impact of social media on kids individually, I think it does really vary, and it depends on how it's being used. And beyond that, I think that it depends on what type of content they're being exposed to. So if they're seeing things that are particularly problematic, super negative. So it depends on what they're being exposed to. It also depends on how much time they're spending, as we talked about, as we discussed, if it's getting in the way of other things that are important for their mental health day to day, then that as well could have a negative impact. So I certainly think it's the case that on a societal level, it's changing the way that we interact with the world. It's changing the way that teenagers interact with the world. That just is the case. Whether that in itself is sort of contributing to some of the mental health issues that we're seeing on this larger scale, again, I think is a tricky question to answer, and I'm not sure that the research so far has settled on that yet.
Okay. Does it have a place in our schools?
How so?
Well, so you see some educators who are now basically saying, okay, they're going to be on their phones, they're going to use social media at school, they're going to find ways to access
Mhm.
it at school. So
Mhm.
let's let them use it. In fact, let me use it in my lesson plans in some way, shape, or form, or as a tool for communication or something like that. Do you think do you think it has a place in our schools?
I think there's maybe a couple different questions there. Like, I think that first of all, it depends on the age. I think if we're talking about, one sort of segment of that is what are the policies that schools have around, say, phone use during the day. That I think probably depends on the age a little bit. And, I know this is challenging because it depends on the school and how they're able to implement these things. But generally, I think we're seeing more and more middle schools, like that age range and younger, try to go phone free during the day, and seeing a lot of positive impacts of that. Whereas high schools are not doing that as much. But I do think that we're seeing some schools that are doing that and happy with the results of it. separate from those larger policies, which are more about, how is an individual teen using their own phone in the ways they want during the day. Should educators incorporate social media in some way into their lessons? That, I think in general, I think that there could be a lot of benefit to that. We know that some digital literacy, teaching about social media, how to use it in healthy ways, talking to teens about this and getting them thinking about how it's impacting them, all of those things I think can be really useful and really powerful. And I certainly think in like a sort of a controlled environment, use of social media with some collaboration and some education around it could be really helpful, actually. So I do think in that way there's probably a place for it in schools.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of one of these things. I mean, I really went back and forth with this as my kids were progressing through K through 12. And it is kind of one of these things where I'm like, well, yeah, I suppose we can, ban it. And also that's never going to happen. Kids are still going to find ways to bring in the phones and to use their phones and to get on whatever platform they want to get on. And also it's not going anywhere. We are not going to suddenly 10 years down the road not have this anymore. So maybe it's better that we just emphasize like healthy ways to use it.
Yeah, I mean, I think I think there's really two sides of it. Like on the one hand, I think that at least up to a certain age, and I would probably include middle school in this age range, I think that because these technologies are built in such a way as to make them really irresistible, hard to put down, I do think it makes sense to have some kind of boundaries around their use, because a lot of kids just are not going to be able to regulate this themselves. Most adults can't regulate it themselves, honestly. Everyone with it, I think we all do, and that's that's just the way these technologies are built, and certainly that may change in the future. As maybe some different legislation and things change around the use of social media for young kids, but for now, I do think that having some boundaries in place, particularly for a middle school age range, makes a lot of sense. On the other hand, what you said as well is true, that at some point they will need to learn to use it in ways that are healthy and that work for them, because I don't think it's going to go away completely. The question is sort of at what age is it right to start encouraging that? And how do we do it in a way where we're actually teaching them to use it in healthy ways rather than sort of giving them free rein and letting them kind of figure it out for themselves, which isn't always, I think, the right strategy.
No, I 100%. I mean, there's a reason why children and adolescents have parents. I mean, we're supposed to set up guardrails and guidance, and their brains are fully developed, and it's really hard for them to have that kind of regulation, that self-management. And like you said too, and I've thought a lot about this over the years. It's especially when I'm tired and I'm worn out. Like, it's really hard for me to regulate my use of my phone. Sometimes I'll be like, why am I needing to pull out my phone because I'm waiting in line at the grocery store? Like, come on, So it's true. It is really easy they've really figured out how to grab our attention.
I mean, I think, and what's interesting is that even, there's some evidence even that teaching kids about some of the tricks that tech companies use to keep their attention, like things like notifications and infinite scroll, which is the fact that, your feed never ends. It just keeps going. There's no stopping cues in there. Teaching kids about those kinds of things, and that they're designed to keep them on there longer and to make these companies more money, that can actually have a positive impact on how teens are using the technology and how they feel about it, how they feel about kind of regulating their use. So I think it's really important to be upfront about that with kids, including that it's hard for everyone.
What about, do you think that there are like more some specific populations of people who social media is maybe a little more problematic for this particular kind of group?
Yeah, I mean, in general, what we see in the research is that teens and young people, and honestly adults as well, who are already struggling in different aspects of their lives, tend to be the people who struggle on social media as well. And perhaps that's not surprising, but, so if a teen is being bullied offline, those tend to be the same kids who are being bullied online. If it's a kid who's more impulsive, getting into trouble offline, then those things likely carry over online as well. And given that a lot of these things are just amplified within an online context, where the scale is bigger, they can basically get into bigger trouble with some of the things that they're doing online. Sometimes we see it in even a larger impact online than offline. So in general, I think kids who are already struggling in different ways may struggle more online. What's interesting though is that with some groups, we also see that they are able to take advantage of more of the benefits of social media as well. So, so for kids who maybe are left out or ostracized in different ways in their online lives, even kids who may be marginalized in some way, whether because of their identities or for other reasons, online, they may be able to find more of a community where they can connect with other people, they can get support, they can, know that they're not alone in whatever they're experiencing. And so sometimes there is this, two sides of the coin for those kids who are struggling offline.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that was such an important point. Like if you're already struggling, then probably those same struggles are going to carry over into the online space. Again, just highlighting what you're saying. So I think it's a really important thing for educators and parents to hear. But I also have one of my very, very good friends, dear colleague, Dr. William Coghill-Barons. He does a lot of research around LGBTQ plus students in school environments. And what you just said about some people from finding community, we know that population has really been able to find community online in ways that are really beneficial to them. So that's I guess that's a positive.
And I recently did this nationally representative survey with Common Sense Media of girls ages 11 to 15 about social media and what they think of social media and how they think it's impacting them. It was just a large scale survey. And we found that among the girls in our sample who identified as LGBTQ, they were reporting both more negative experiences online, so more of the bullying and negative social stuff, exposure to more problematic content, but they were also reporting more of the positive stuff. So they were reporting more, connection and identity affirmation and these things that I think are really important and sometimes hard to find in the offline world for kids. So it's interesting that I think it's sort of, it can be both at the same time, and maybe just speaks to the fact that we really need to provide support to some of these groups of kids who and help them with using technology in the ways that work for them while kind of minimizing the risks that they're running into.
Yeah, and that kind of leads me to my next question, which I feel like I already know what your response is going to be, but I have to ask it anyway, because I feel like other people are going to want to know this too.
We're going to surprise you.
Maybe you will. Have you found in your research, or have you read in other studies, that there are some apps that are more harmful or problematic than other apps?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I'm going to give a predictable answer here then, which is no. No, I think that the app itself, and this honestly becomes even more true over time as apps integrate more and more different features where they start to kind of look similar to each other. So for example, on Instagram used to just be, when it first started, of course, was just like posting pictures. Now there are reels, which are videos. There are stories, which disappear after 24 hours. There's direct messaging. There's shopping. There's a lot more sort of algorithmically recommended content versus content from friends. And in that way, it looks a little more like TikTok and it looks like Snapchat with the, and so it's, these technologies, I think themselves, it's hard to say that one is maybe more problematic than another. But the way that they're used, I think, is really the thing to be paying attention to. And And we certainly see that kids use different tech in different ways. The last thing I'll say about that is just that we know that right now, at least in the preteen, teen age range and young adults as well, that TikTok is the most popular and that young people are spending the most amount of time on TikTok. But what's really interesting about TikTok is that the content is really algorithmically recommended. So it's really based on what the algorithm is showing to kids, and so kids often find that their TikTok experience looks very different than their friends' TikTok experience because the algorithm has started to generate and provide them with types of content that their friends aren't even seeing. So there are all these sort of different subcultures and things on TikTok. And so when working with kids in relation to their use of TikTok, I think it's worth thinking about what are they seeing and really trying to figure out like what it looks like for them individually, because it really varies between different kids.
Yeah. It is so funny when you say that because every once in a while, one of my friends will send me like a TikTok and I'll be like, what the heck side of TikTok are you on to get a video like that? I don't know about you, but I am on the baker side of TikTok.
All of it. And there's, that's what I mean. Those kids will describe all the different sides of TikTok, and it's really easy to sort of get down a rabbit hole. And sometimes it's totally harmless and like baking or whatever it is, the hobby that they have. And sometimes it can really get them to a dark place with the stuff that they're being recommended as it gets more extreme. And so I think it's really something to be careful about. Yeah.
Yes. And if you haven't discovered the 24 days of holiday cookie TikTok, then I highly recommend it.
That sounds like a side I would
do cookie every day, and I'm loving it. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about specific advice for educators, school administrators and educators around technology, social media. If you had one piece of advice to give to school administrators who are like actually making these rules and guidelines in our districts, would you have a piece of advice to give them? What would it be? What if you had to? What if I said to you, you have to give them a piece of advice? What would you say?
So the first piece of advice I would give is, I think, to implement some kind of education around this stuff, because I think that Common Sense has some great resources that I helped develop actually, but there's lots of other in addition to those, there's lots of other kind of digital citizenship type resources out there that teach media literacy and other skills that I really think that in this day and age that is one of the most important things that we can provide to kids, because they're going to be running into these technologies, whether or not it's at this moment, depending on their age, or in the future. And I think that helping them learn how to navigate them is going to probably go a lot farther than any kind of restriction or rule that we put in place. That's not to say that there shouldn't be rules and restrictions, but if I had to pick one piece of advice, I think that would be the first one.
You made me, when you were talking through that, you made me think of something else, which is that, you said this is part of their life, right? And like one thing that we oftentimes do to children and adolescents is like kind of minimize things that are a big deal to them. And that's hurtful and harmful. And if this really is a big part of their life and the way they socialize, the way that they connect, the way that they find entertainment, the way that they enjoy recreation, then I agree with you. Like, just like kind of making fun of it in front of them is only creating more disconnect between the educator or the adult and the child. And I'm not saying that we have to like fully go on board and like dive into TikTok and Instagram and have, I'm not saying necessarily that, but I don't think that, basically poo-pooing it and making them feel like it's something less than the way that we interact with life or do life is probably not a good idea. What do
Yeah,
you
I do
think?
think that we sometimes inadvertently send some mixed messages around social media and tech for sure. And I think there's of course good reason why we do this. A lot of it is based in just wanting what's best for them and being sort of scared about some of what's out there. But I do think sometimes there are mixed messages that we give in terms of on the one hand, saying that, it's just social media, it's no big deal, why are you so obsessed with it? Those kind of messages. And then on the other hand, these kind of fear-based messages of if you post the wrong thing online, it's gonna, it could ruin your life. And these things are really dangerous and they have a negative impact on your mental health. And we're sort of giving these two two
Yeah,
things that are seemingly in contrast with each other and don't necessarily line up with kids' day-to-day actual experiences on these technologies. And so I think it's tricky to figure out what the right messaging should be around it. But I do think that we have a long way to go in terms of figuring it out.
yeah, yeah, we do, and I'm sure. And the other thing about that is that it's just always changing. It's like
Yeah.
moving target.
Hmm.
So it's
Hmm.
like trying to stay on top of it, especially as you are still in the teaching profession or when you have children that you're trying to raise and do right by.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, this is the burning question that we all have for you, Dr. Nisi. You are a mother of two.
Mhm.
What are the rules going to be technology and social media in
Yes.
your
Oh my
house?
gosh. Well, I get this question a lot. um,
Tell
and
us.
so right now I have a 2-year-old and a 2-month-old. So they are definitely not using social media yet. And what I always say to this question and what I really think is that the technology is going to look so different by the time they are at the age where they would be using social media that we just know based on, the last 10 years up till now, if we think about what technology looked like in 2013 versus right now, it's a whole different world and it's a whole different, set of guidelines that we need to have for our kids. And I think that will unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, probably be true by the time my kids are at the age where they're using it. One thing I will say is that, being a parent, becoming a parent a couple years ago has made me a lot more aware of my own social media use. So even if I don't have a clear idea yet of what it will look like for them, for me, I'm now just a lot more aware of how it's impacting me, what I'm modeling for them in terms of my use, whether and when it's interfering with my parenting and my relationships with them. I'm sort of much more careful about that, and I hope that that's something that I will keep working on and keep in mind as my kids get older as well.
Yeah, I think that that's beautiful advice. And we talk about that a lot when we are in schools, which is, kiddos aren't going to necessarily listen to what we have to say, but they oftentimes do emulate our actions, the things that we do. And, if you're constantly around adults that are always on technology and on their phones, then they're going to do the same thing. Okay, well, we really appreciate your time with us today, Dr. Nisi. This is just really such an important topic. For not just educators, but for parents, for our community, for our students. So thank you very, very much for coming on and sharing your expertise.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
During and after my conversation today with Dr. Nisi, I really started to think a lot about just how complex the mental health crisis is in our world. And of course, it makes sense, right? Because humans are just complex beings living in an increasingly complex global world. So, unfortunately, I think there are lots of people who want a definitive answer. I do this, this, and this, and I'm going to have this outcome when it comes to not just technology, the use of technology and social media with our students and with our children, but with everything, with the behaviors that we're seeing in the classroom, with our truancy issues in schools, with our crises that we have with housing instability, so on and so forth. And unfortunately, because we are complex human beings living in a complex world with very complex systems, as we discovered today with Dr. Nisi, there really isn't a one size fits all. There are guardrails that we can put up and there's guidance that we can provide. But at the end of the day, I think it really does fall on the common sense of adults and adults really thinking through who they are and what they value and how they want to raise their children and what's important to them as a family and how we really want our schools to function and what we want students to get out of school or schooling. I do think, with all of that being said, I do think there are a couple things that really stuck out for me in this conversation with Dr. Nisi. And the first one is just this suggestion that we really need to tend to all dimensions of our wellness before we start to infuse technology into our daily lives. So, are you getting enough sleep? Are you, eating healthy foods? Are you socializing with people outside of an online platform, on a regular basis in a healthy way? Are you making connections to your environment and spending enough time outside, moving your body in a joyful way? And like, if you are doing all of those things, then like putting some technology in your life for recreation or enjoyment seems to be pretty harmless, I think, at this point, is what we're discovering. So like, that's the first thing that I think we need to think about. The other thing that I think is really important for us to remember is that if somebody is experiencing challenges in their life, outside of technology. So if you are being bullied, at school or in the workplace, or if you're experiencing high levels of stress or anxiety, in your home for various reasons, or in school or at work, then probably those same things are going to show up in an online platform or, the way that you're using technology. So I think that that's something to remember too. If your student or child is experiencing high levels of anxiety and it's really hard for them, to bounce back from negative comments, if they tend to perseverate on things, then it's probably good for you to know that they're probably going to show up in the same ways online and maybe even make that anxiety or depression even worse. And on the flip side of that coin, we also know that there are certain groups of people who are marginalized that also find some really great community online as well, community that they really need in order to get through some of their struggles that they are experiencing and battling with in their own lives. So all of this is to say, it doesn't seem to be like there is one answer for any of us in terms of whether or not social media is good or bad. It seems to be how we use it and how we incorporate it into our lives in healthy ways. But I would love to hear from all of you. What are your thoughts and feelings about this topic? Or do you have suggestions and stories to share with us for new episodes? And if you do, then we would love to hear from you. You can email us at scsmh-maine@uiowa.edu. Thank you so much for joining me today. And until next time, I'm your host, Dr. Carrie Vogelgy, saying forever cheering you on.